Hello, and welcome to Yesterday, Today, and Forever, a virtual ministry of the Churches of Christ. It is our desire to present to the 21st century person the faith of the first century Christians. We seek unity through the acceptance of the faith that was once and for all time delivered unto the saints, a system of faith which first began to be spoken by our Lord prior to his crucifixion, and was later confirmed to the saints by the apostles and inspired writers of the New Testament. Thus a faith from yesterday to today and into forever. Our speaker is Brian Barrett, who preaches for the church at Bear Branch, in Spurlockville, West Virginia. We encourage all persons interested in the faith of our fathers to open their Bibles, as we search the Scriptures, for these eternal truths, which can lead Christians back into unity as the family of God. Now, here is Brian.
Good morning. Good morning. We're studying this morning in the book of John chapter 6. John chapter 6. In our ending part of the 5th chapter, we see that Jesus had been there speaking with some of the religious leaders, speaking to them about the various proofs as to who he was. As we come into the 6th chapter this morning, we do so with the statement, after these things. After Jesus had had his interaction with these Jewish leaders, once these things were finished, it says, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great multitude followed him because they saw his miracles which he did on them that were diseased. As we look at this statement, we find one of the clear reasons why many people followed Jesus. Last couple weeks, we've been looking at some of the religious leaders who were going where Jesus was and trying to stir up trouble, trying to get the people to leave. So some were following him just to try and turn his ministry upside down. Others were following Jesus, as we see here, because of the miracles which he did on those that were diseased, and they were wanting either miracles of their own, or they just wanted to see him do more miracles. I'm sure it had to be an amazing thing to witness these miracles, to see people who were crippled and lame, blind, with so many different types of problems and situations. And as we look at this period of time, and as we think about that, we see the people today, how that many people will flock to what I call the fake healers. And you can imagine what it would be like to truly witness a miracle, to see someone who's been crippled all of their life walk, to see someone who's blind and has been blind from birth to see, and to see the reaction of the individuals and their families. And so without being disrespectful, I just want to say it was a good show. It was a good show. It was and had entertainment value. And I'm not saying that it didn't have a spiritual significance to some of these, but it was something unique. It was something that was different, and so therefore it also has the entertainment value associated with it. And so, for whatever reason, the multitudes were following Jesus, and we find distinctions along the writings here. When we find statements like multitudes followed him, and then John makes reference to the disciples. And so John distinguishes between those in large numbers who were following Jesus versus those who were his close disciples, true followers, and the apostles that were there with him. And so as they followed him and did these things, verse 3, Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And so we see that difference brought out here. The multitudes are following. There's a multitude of people, but Jesus goes up into the mountain, and he takes with him his disciples, those who are his close associates, those whom he trusts, those who he is preparing for leadership in the church as it comes. And so he brings them up with him into the mountain in elevation, in essence, to where they can look over and see all the people which are. And it tells us in verse 4, and the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. And so we're coming up to sometime in what we would think of as March or April. And on the Jewish calendar, it was the 10th day of the first month that began the Passover and the things that were associated with it. And so the Passover was close. It was nearing. Generally, if they could, people would make their way to Jerusalem for the Passover, but it was getting near. And so we have a statement about that, and we'll comment a little bit more on that as we go down. It says, when Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him, he said unto Philip, whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? Now, Jesus had his closer disciples and some of those who were, we think of as apostles, there with him. He took them up in elevation up the mountain, and he can look out and see all these individuals, this great number of people that's assembled there. And so Jesus, having saw them in this number, points out Philip or speaks to him directly, saying, where can we buy bread that these may eat? We have this large multitude of people, and so he turns to Philip. It's one of those times where, I don't know about you, but I was the kind of student originally in school that never wanted to sit in front of the class because I knew the teacher was going to pick on you. They were going to ask questions. And so I kind of tried to get in the back and would kind of scooch down in the seat, hoping that I could hide behind somebody else's head, because I never really liked those spur of the moment, ask a question and point you out along the way. And so here we are. Jesus is with his close disciples, and Jesus signals Philip out from the rest of them. And he says, where do you suppose we can get enough bread that we can feed all these people? Now, it says, in verse 6, this he said to prove him, that's Philip, for he himself, that is Jesus, knew what he would do. Jesus knew what he had planned to do all along. And so it wasn't anything that was a surprise to him. And it says that he spoke this to Philip with the intent of proving him. Sometimes a teacher will call on you, kind of nudge you a little bit to see. And so you'll see that you're not maybe living up to the expectations, or it's trying to test you. And this is what Jesus was doing with Philip. Jesus knew, as with many other things, what he needed to do and what he could do and how he was going to handle it. But here's one of the people who are going to be a leader in the church. And so Jesus asked him, what would you do? What do you suppose, you can do? Where can we get enough bread to feed all of these people? Now, the question is interesting because Jesus or John notes that the Passover is near. When the Passover in Jewish customs began to be near, the Jewish households began to purge leaven from their house. We generally call leaven yeast. The things that would leaven the bread, cause it to rise. And during the Passover, the celebration of the Passover also is connected with the celebration of unleavened bread in remembrance of the children of Israel's speedy leaving of Egypt. Some say that, they didn't have time to let bread raise, and so they created this unleavened bread. So this is kind of interesting because at this time of the year, in Jewish communities, what we think of as loaves of bread, the nice, fluffy, thick, that you can slice into. What you basically ended up with at this time of the year is something that is more closer to our communion bread, matzah, which is an unleavened matzos, which is an unleavened bread. It's just usually made with just plain old flour that's been crushed out of the wheat. There's no leavening there. They mix it with water, sometimes a little bit of oil, sometimes a little bit of salt, but they put it on the heat rather quickly and it's fried up. In that day and age, it probably looked a lot more like what we think of as flatbread or the flour tortilla kind of thing. But it was made with unleavened bread, so there really wasn't much there. And so it really wasn't a time that people were really baking up a whole lot of bread and those kind of things, because they were headed toward the Passover, and the Passover was limited in its dietary kind of things. And so they started this unleavened bread, the eating of that early on. And so Philip answered him as he kind of looks among the multitude, and he says, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. And notice what Philip says. Philip talks about the great expense, and he says 200 pennyworth wouldn't buy enough for these people just to basically have something to just take a bite off of. And not talking about filled. Philip doesn't say anything about that they may eat and be filled, but he says that they may take a little, have enough just to kind of get them through. Now, the translation, of course, we have here in the King James is a pennyworth, but the actual coin itself is a Roman coin, the denarius, and the denarius, the coin, is of Latin or Roman origins. And it's interesting that the Latin for this coin, denarius, means 10 asses, donkeys. That's what the coin basically is referring to. And the value of the coin at the time it originated was 10 asses. And so in a day of trading, one of these coins would purchase 10 animals. And so you could buy 10 animals with it. And so it came to be known as the denarius, or the 10 asses. And so that was a trade, we know basically what the value is. Now we put $100 or $50 or $20 or 5 cents, and everybody, So if you think about that, you're talking about multiples of 10, and so he's talking about 200 pennyworth. So that would be like 2,000 asses. Would the value of that? Trading that many animals would not produce enough food for them to take a little. And so at least Philip's scratching his head. It's like, we don't have that kind of money. And so when we think about, sometimes these coins and all that's translated over, this is a great amount. This is a good size amount of people. I don't know how much bread you could trade 2,000 animals for, but I would imagine it would be a pretty good amount of bread. And Philip says that still wouldn't be enough for them to just take a little. So we can't get sometimes a head count. A lot of times we don't in the scriptures just know exactly what the number is. It's generally just referred to as multitudes. But here, as we look at that, we get an idea of the size and number of the people that were coming and following Jesus. And so this was a test, to see how Philip would consider it. The easy answer could be, Lord, I don't know how we're going to do it, but I'm pretty sure I can take care of it. But that wasn't his answer. He was one of those people who has to put the pencil to the paper and start doing some figuring and all, and he just comes to a conclusion. We don't have enough to buy and feed these people. His answer basically is, we don't have enough, and I don't know how we're going to do it. Of course, Jesus already knew what he was going to do. And so in the midst of this discussion, it says, one of his disciples, Andrew, which was Simon Peter's brother, said unto him, There is a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many? There was not apparently a lot of planning that was done by these individuals who were following Jesus. Many of them, when they heard that Jesus was in the area, it seems that they just kind of dropped whatever they were doing and tried to go find him. And there wasn't a lot of planning about, well, how long are we going to be gone? And, what do we need to take with us? They were in a hurry, it seems, because they made really no plans whatsoever. These people had made no plans to eat or how long they were going to stay. Andrew, it's not stated specifically here that Jesus asked him anything, but Andrew says, we got this little lad here, this little boy, and he has 5 loaves and 2 small fishes. But then he says, what good are those among so many? Since this was during the time of the coming of the Passover, a lot of people comment that this was probably what we would think of as a little boy's lunch. Now, why he ended up with this or why he had it, we don't really have an answer when so many people apparently were not prepared, but he did have that. But, I would think of these, when you hear the word loaves, you think about going to the store and pulling a loaf of Heiner's bread off the shelf, and that's not meant to be an advertisement. That's just, but you go there and you want your white bread and you pull a loaf off the shelf and you think of 5 loaves of bread and you see, these fishes and I don't know what that takes to your mind, whether you're thinking of a catfish or a swordfish or how big the fish is. But remember, this is a little lad. He's not even a grown man, or just have this lad here. And so the word here for loaves, while sometimes may mean the sense of a loaf of bread, it's at this time of year they were more like cakes, little what we think of as pancakey kind of, as I said, flour tortilla, flat bread, these kind of things, and it may very well be that there was even smaller than that. And by smaller than that, I mean that we may be talking about something like a saltine cracker, something reasonably small, 5 little pieces of this unleavened bread which had been made, and these 2 fishes here, and they were 2 small fishes, and they were probably the type of fish that was dried and was salted and then dried, so it was dried fish. And so there's not much here, a couple pieces probably dried fish and 5 small pieces of bread that was intended to be used with the fish. So if you have 2 small fish, you don't need a whole lot of bread for 2 small fish. And so it was just meant to be a little lad's as lunch or whatever time was there. And so we have two answers here in the midst of this. Jesus asked for one, and he says, it would take 200 pennies worth in order just to have enough bread, or if we could find it, to let them have a little. And then Andrew proposes, well, we've got this one fella here who's got a little bit of food, but, what is this among such a great multitude of people? And so these are the 2 answers that John gives us, which implies that the rest of the disciples were just as confused as Andrew and Philip. I don't really know what we're going to do. I mean, Peter and Andrew and James and John, they were all fishermen, but they weren't fishing today, and they didn't have nets, and they didn't have a big catch to offer here. So, they might have known how they could have got some fish and things given enough time, but that's not going to remedy the situation right now. And so if we find ourselves there, and so with Philip not having a good answer, and Andrew, his solution, is in the opposite direction. He's got the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, but, all that's going to do is create a riot if all these people are trying to get this little boy's lunch. And so we are at a standstill as far as that's concerned. But Jesus knew what he intended to do. He understood what he could and what he couldn't do. And so Jesus said, "Make the men sit down now." There was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. So we get a idea now of the number of men that sat down. But we have the little lad, and if there was one little lad, there was probably some more little lads and some women and others. So we don't really have still an accurate account, but we can clearly see that there was at least 5,000 men. So the multitude was indeed a multitude, and he had them to sit down. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were set down, and likewise of the fishes as many as they would. When they were filled, he said unto his disciples, Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Therefore they gathered them together and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves which remained over and above unto them that had eaten. And so this miracle that Jesus performs is quite uh, frankly and forward, is a creation miracle. Jesus knew what he could do. I mean, in the beginning, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So it's not that hard to say, "Let there be fish," and there was fish. I mean, he talked about in Genesis 1 about, let the waters bring forth and every creeping thing and all this by the spoken word of God. And so Jesus gave thanks. He broke the bread and distributed among his disciples. And as they were distributing, it multiplied itself. It not only multiplied to meet the needs of those who were assembled there, but Jesus also wanted to, he could have just left it at that they all ate and they were filled. But the interesting thing is Jesus says, go and gather up what's left over, what the people didn't eat. Now, that implies that they had ate their fill. If you have a free lunch, you might as well, and don't know where your next meal's coming from, you might as well go ahead and get your money's worth. And so they ate and they were filled and there were things left over. And so rather than just leaving it at that, Jesus looks to his disciples, the apostles, and those close to him, and he says, let's not waste this. Let's go and round up what's left over. It says that they had 12 baskets from the fragments of the 5 loaves, which were there over and above what it was that they ate. And so they started out with 5 small loaves and 2 fishes, and they had 12 baskets full of fragments, pieces of the broken bread and all that was left after that everyone had completely ate their fill. And so the only way that you can explain that is to explain it clearly as a miracle, but it's a miracle that shows the creative force in creating, providing that to them and the fishes so that they were able to eat. And John shows us that just as he said in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So we have this example here that he has the ability to create. It's one thing that we've talked about if someone has a crippled arm to heal it. And we've talked about crippled legs and what would have to happen in order to do that. And that's kind of rearranging the creation in a way that restores. But this is an interesting miracle in the sense that he didn't just take the 5 loaves and 2 fishes and rearrange them into a pot of soup or something. I mean, we're actually talking about a miracle of creation in its truest sense, that the food was multiplied. Excuse me. So the people were greatly impressed at this miracle, and this miracle kind of gets them to thinking about what it was like when the children of Israel were traveling in the wilderness with Moses. What happened to the children in the wilderness when they became hungry? God sent bread down from heaven. He sent the manna. And every morning, the manna was there and they were able to gather it up. Now, these people had never seen the manna, but nonetheless, they had heard of it and it had been talked about. And so they kind of have themselves a manna moment here. They have a time where, the master has literally brought bread from heaven because they knew they didn't have it. And, if everybody ate, they could see that no one was carrying that kind of food. And so we literally have a bread from heaven kind of moment. Now, it's not the original manna, but it is on the equal kind of basis. And so Verse 14 says, "Then those men, when they had seen the miracles that Jesus did, said, 'This is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world.'" Because there is this parallel between the manna in the wilderness and this just making bread out of thin air, which is what manna seemed to the people of Israel. It just showed up out of thin air when they woke up. They began to make the statement, referring back to the prophecy in Deuteronomy 18, there in verses 15 and following, where Moses speaks about that God would raise up a prophet like unto himself and that they should hear him. And the parallel is so close that the men who witnessed the miracle, many of those who were there and talking, he's not necessarily talking about the disciples of Christ, but he's talking about the men that were there. They began to say, what more proof do we need that this is the prophet that Moses spoke of? As Moses gave them manna in the wilderness and bread in the wilderness, so he has given us bread in the wilderness also. And this started a process. In verse 15, it says, "When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself alone." So strong was the insistence and belief of the people that this was the prophet, and the prophet that was to come would also have been their king. And so they began to talk among themselves and discuss the issue. And Jesus perceived, or he understood their hearts, and he understood that, they weren't just talking about, gee, isn't this a coincidence? But Jesus begins to perceive and understand that, if things that day remained as they were without some type of interference, they were in the process of coming and by force making him a king. Now, that doesn't mean that they were going to twist his arm and make him king, but what it basically is saying is that the people were willing to join together and fight, and that, as we've said before, the Jews believed a way of overthrowing the Romans and their captors, and they would establish their king, and he would sit on the throne of David forever. And we talk about a lot of that. And so they were willing to side with him and go to war. That's what we're talking about. By force, make him a king. And it wasn't that they would have to force Jesus to be a king, but the problem was they would have to, by force, overcome the Romans and the Jewish authorities in order to set him on the throne. And so they were right at the precipice, in essence, of a civil war breaking out at this point. And so, rather than spurring this on any further, Jesus makes a retreat, in essence, away from them, and gives this whole thing a chance to die down some before he again begins to address the people. Anyone have any questions or comments down through verse 15?
I think this has been a lesson of faith. Where was their faith that he was going to feed them? Did they just not have it? Or was it kind of one of those things where we get scared? You know what I mean?
I don't, there's lots of things that came up along the way that we have to ask that same kind of question, having seen what he'd done before, why did they just not say, well, I'm not sure what I would do, but I know you can take care of it. So I don't know. Of course, the pressure may have been on them. They may have felt pressured. When somebody asks you a question, you feel pressured to answer it. And of course, in the spur of the moment, it's hard to tell which way we're going to go if we don't prepare ourselves. Philip just kind of went with a worldly kind of answer. But yeah, it is a matter of faith. The first thing that came to their mind wasn't, I know, Lord, that with you all things are possible, and that you'll take care of it. So,
Sometimes we are scared to ask for help, even though we know that people may be able to help us. You kind of go about it the wrong way. Like, you don't just ask for help. Well, I don't know what to do. What could we do with, this boy's lunch? What could we do with that? Like, we can't do anything, but what can you do without saying it out loud?
yeah, and that's it's possible. There's a lot of in hearing something stated, the way in tone in which we just have it here on paper. We don't have all the punctuation and a lot of that. So I don't know. But, the quick answer never came up, just to say, well, Lord, I'm sure, I have faith that you can do all things. That would have been what for us today would be the reasonable answer. But like I said, when you're sitting in that classroom and the teacher calls on you, sometimes your brain just freezes, even if you know the answer. I just never, believe it or not, I never used to like to be in a position of where I didn't like to stand at the front of the class. I didn't want to sit at the front of the class. I didn't want to answer. I know it'd be hard to believe now. I can't shut up, but it's when even when you know the answer, when you're a little shy or backward or whatever the case may be, that your brain just kind of locks up on you in the middle of those things. So I don't know if that was the case. That after it was all over with, Philip may have said, "Well, I should have known that," or Andrew or one of the others said, "Well, we out of the 12 of us, none of us gave a good answer." Whether they were hinting for Jesus to do something or we don't have a clue. Out of the whole lot of the disciples, his closest associates, none of them seemed to come up with a really good answer that we would expect today. It's a good comment, good question. Lord willing, we will pick up with that idea in verse 15 where we left off next Lord's Day.
Why not make this the day that you and your family seek out the Church of Christ in your community? We encourage you to attend one of our worship times or Bible studies. God's grace, truth, and salvation is truly worth finding and knowing. May God bless and keep you as we walk together in His truth. And remember, as always, the Churches of Christ salute you. Our new programs are posted to Facebook and YouTube on Thursday afternoon, and they should be available for viewing by 7 p.m. We also encourage our viewers to visit our website at www.thechurchesofchrist.life. We ask that you like us on Facebook and share our programs. On YouTube, please share and subscribe for notifications. This program was pre-recorded.